Morning, Jan.
It was a good start to the batting, and they've seen off that youngster spinner very well, and then suddenly did a collapse.
Johan, if you could just repeat the question.
Well, it was a good start batting, and also seeing off that youngster, and then suddenly there was a collapse. What can it be attributed to? What, or it's just one thing, one wicket leading to another?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Look, I've certainly have my own experiences as a player when it comes to subcontinent conditions that those kind of things can happen. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in a position where you're coming up against one of the best spinners in the world. At times, guys found themselves in tricky situations where they didn't pick him. So you're getting yourself into positions that's obviously not a strong position to play the ball. And unfortunately, when you indecisive in movements from time to time, that you can be caught off guard. And unfortunately, that's where we find ourselves. There's no running from a situation like this. We were well below par in both games. And that's something that we have to turn the mirror on ourselves and ask ourselves the question, okay, so with that in mind, how are we going to get better? You have a short turnaround. There's literally 36 hours before we have to play a game. So very much it's about a mental switch in understanding how am I going to commit to my options, how am I going to commit to my game plan, and take it from there.
Thanks, Johan. Stu?
Yes, Lucy. Hi, JB.
Hi, Stu.
This is something. I mean, the batting problems is not it's not new. It's not just this isn't hasn't just happened in Sharjah. It's something that we saw a little bit of in the West Indies, and I know there were some difficult conditions in New York during the World Cup. Um, is is there a deeper issue with South African batting that needs to be resolved? We've heard Rob talk about perhaps guys needing to play more matches even. How do you go about solving a problem that looks deeper than just it's the subcontinent and its difficult conditions and a great spinner?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's a definitive answer to that. I think it's a combination of things. So, like you mentioned there, Rob mentioned guys need to be playing more games. I mean, if you think about just this fixture for itself, it wasn't necessarily on the calendar. And fortunately, we found ourselves here playing against Afghanistan in these conditions. What it allows for is exposure. It allows for guys to be playing in conditions that's a little bit foreign, but also coming up against opposition that you won't necessarily play in South Africa. In terms of the deeper rooted issues, I think we are always going to be exposed if you're not exposed to something earlier on. All right, so I'm of the opinion that we're going to have to learn the hard way from a batting point of view. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that it's in our games that we're going to find the greatest learning. There's, as I said earlier, there's no running away from it. However, we have to see this as, the opportunity for guys to come in and be exposed to certain conditions. What are we going to be facing in a few months' time in Champions Trophy? Okay, so if this is an exposure for that, how do we adapt? How do we find options that allows us to be successful in conditions such as this one? When it comes to deeper rooted issues, unfortunately, that's a harsh reality we have to accept. We find ourselves in situations where guys are coming in and unfortunately not living up to the mark. But that doesn't mean they're not good enough. It doesn't mean that they don't have the competitive nature in them. It's just about advancing and creating a bigger toolbox for them. And that's on us as coaches as well. It's not just the players that are not performing. How do we turn the motor on ourselves as coaches and help them be the best version of themselves? And if they are being the best version of themselves, ultimately we give them the best chance of winning games for South Africa. So that's the hope.
Thanks, Stu. Ongama?
Thanks, Lucy. JP, we're talking about the West Indies, and obviously the series right now we just lost. And I think we might find ourselves having a lot of people say that these boys are not good enough, or maybe these three series say something about
No, I wouldn't say it's necessarily fair, but I think it's a fair. It's not a fair reflection in terms of where domestic cricket is. I think it's just a fair reflection of us as individual players. So it's not necessarily everybody that finds themselves in tough situations. There's a handful of players that find themselves there. So again, you know, it's not exclusively to some crop of players. Everybody has to put up their hands and say, listen, okay, how do I get better here? And it's not just the individual going by themselves and saying, okay, I need to do this, I need to do that. It's about asking for help. It's about coming together as a batting unit and saying, okay, so what is the collective learnings? How do we get better? And what are we going to do about it? What was the second part of your question? Sorry?
I was just asking, how would you describe where this current team is at the moment?
In a difficult position. You know, you think about this tour, and I know there's been a lot of murmurs around opportunity and winning games for South Africa, and there's been sort of terms thrown around that it's not exclusive. I think where we have to admit for ourselves is that, yes, we find ourselves in a bit of a developmental growth phase. However, that doesn't exclude the idea of we trying to win games for South Africa. It's a combination of the two. But you know, as coaches, we're always wrestling with this idea of challenge and support. And you know, you find yourself in a situation where how do you support, but how do you challenge players to be better? How do you create a platform for them to go back and work on their games and find themselves in a situation where they can come back in again and be better? You know, what are the things that they need to work on? And that's, again, for us as coaches to be very mindful of.
Thanks. So Gomez, here.
JP, how you doing? Obviously when you started as a youngster, the landscape of the game was a hell of a lot different. Your players wouldn't play in leagues. It was different. But when you walked into start the York career, you would have batted around senior players as a young player. There would be senior players in the team where if you look at someone like possibly Tristan Stubbs, who you want to go forward, he walks in with a debut on both sides of it. Is there value in throwing them all together in at the time, or isn't this process still a new batter trying to make his way alongside a senior batter rather than this whole crop together going forward? Doesn't it do them more damage than actual good?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Zaire. Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's a difficult one to balance, and I think the important point that you raised there was the landscape was different. So as coaches, you got to find the best solution with the situation that you find yourself in. I think in a best case scenario, you're always wanting guys to come in with great experience each side of you for sure. But I look at guys like Temba, Reza, Aiden, who possess experience in all formats. Or Reza not so much obviously in Test cricket, but he's certainly in white ball cricket. Guys have played a lot of cricket, even though it's inexperienced necessarily in international cricket, and I guess that's the sort of baptism of fire for those guys. But I look at a guy like Tristan Stubbs, who has the ability to influence guys around him. You know, just the demeanor that he has, the way he preps for his game, the communication that he has with those guys. We talk about it in terms of having those performance connections and relationships with guys. I think it's there. So we don't have the luxury of how you refer it to my case. So now it's about trying to find the best solution that we can with the situation we find ourselves in. And I think we're trying to manage it as best as we can. But it doesn't take away, the experience of cricket that these guys have. And now it's just about trying to marry that with, in these conditions, which is foreign, and then opposition that we haven't necessarily faced before.
Thanks. So here we'll look to take a couple of follow-up questions before we wrap today's media up. Stu, please go ahead.
Thanks. JP, you mentioned his name there as one of the experienced
Well, the connection that I have with Reza, most times it's not necessarily about a technical thing or anything like that. I think it's more just about understanding that he belongs. You know, I spoke earlier about this wrestle of challenge and support. He's a guy that needs a lot of support and a lot of love when it comes to his game. You know, he's had an interesting career where he's had to wait a long time for opportunities, and now he's been getting opportunities, and it's, you know, it's been up and down. You can't take away the quality of the player, 100%. But at the end of the day, you know, we always going to be accountable for our performances, and that's something that he needs to obviously be accountable for, and us as coaches need to be accountable for. I've got a strong belief that he can find his way to come back, 100%. Yes, we've got one more game here, and as much as it feels like he's out of form, he's a quality player that I believe can find his way back, and hopefully we can assist him in that and give him another chance to prove himself.
Thanks, Stu. Last two questions on Gama.
Thanks, Lucy. JP, just we've played these guys twice now. We've faced like this bowling attack twice now. What sort of lessons are we taking from these two games and taking them forward to the next game?
Well, it was mentioned earlier that, you know, there was certainly a more confident start. If you think back to the first game, I think it was 36 for 7 in the power play. I mean, it doesn't matter who you're playing against, that's never going to be good enough. So there were some strides made in that power play. The thing that we often reflect upon is what was our mindset, and were we confident in the options that we took, and what was the execution. Those are the things that we're going to be reflecting on. And obviously when you reflect upon it individually, it might be different according to the situation of the game, according to the opposition and conditions. I think the answer to that lies within one-on-one connections and understanding where did I come up short, and what do I need to do to be better. And that's essentially where we're going to be sitting over the next 24 hours and have clarity in that. And if we can have clarity in that, we give ourselves the best option and give ourselves the best opportunity to be the best that we can be. You know, the game of cricket is a fickle one in the sense that you don't have a lot of control of a lot of things. But the thing that we do have is preparation and our mindset going into the game and backing our skills. And that's the only thing that I can enhance and certainly try and encourage. And hopefully that result will come that we know we can get.
Thanks, Ongama. And I see Zee has also raised his hand again there. So these will officially be the last two questions. Werner, please go ahead. Then we'll wrap with Sahir.
Hi, JP. Just a general question about the approach to batting in the series against the spinners. Seen most of the batters hanging on the back foot and end up playing back to very full deliveries and then not having time to react to the ball turning off the surface. Not a lot of players coming down the wicket trying to smother the ball or sweep the ball. Somebody like a Tony did that well yesterday and just put the bowler a bit off their legs, trying to put some pressure back. Is that something that you guys have discussed? More of the other batters might taking that type of approach or just changing things up a bit?
Yeah, I spoke earlier about adding to the toolbox. And what I mean by that is, you know, speaking around options against various bowlers. And that's certainly something that we will continue to chat about. You know, when you think about certain guys that have not faced these guys in the recent times, and also when you find yourself in a tricky situation where you're not picking the ball, so you make mention of guys not using their feet. You know, when the ball is turning both ways, it's often a tough option to take when you're not sure which way the ball is turning. Once you get comfortable in understanding and seeing what you need to be seeing out of the hand, I think that's when clarity comes in terms of the options. Sweeping is always going to be an option that we're going to encourage here, you know, particularly in these conditions, and we've seen you know, them do it with great success as well. When I say them, I'm talking about the Afghanistan batters. So that's certainly something that we will look at and see how can we be more proactive rather than reactive. And I think when you're playing off the back foot consistently and getting found out, I think that's the reaction that you're referring to. So that proactiveness in terms of mindset and option is going to be something that we're going to have to be better at.
Thanks. So here?
So you touched on every aspect of my question in terms of, so you've always spoken about processes and preparation, that's the key. And in the previous briefing that Mulder spoke about not having seen Russian quite often.
Sorry, Zaria, your mic is a little bit softer there. I'm not sure.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go.
Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. I said you've always spoken about processes and preparation, and Vian said in the previous press conference that they hadn't seen Rasenfa much of him. In today's world, there's video footage all over the place. Just how is that? How did that occur? That you know that there wasn't much to be seen of him before, because obviously we saw him. Everybody batted a little bit better against him yesterday after the first game. So just in terms of getting hands on the video analysis on the video, like isn't that what international cricket is about? The prep.
Yeah. So even if you think about, playing him better in the second game, it wasn't necessarily about the footage that we saw. I think it was more around the conversation about how are we gonna play this guy. So obviously coming into this game, in the first game, not having seen much of him is not necessarily looked at as a big threat. All right, and then you see the impact he has on the game. And yes, you are exposed to a little bit more footage, but even in that footage, there wasn't necessarily close-up zooms to be able to decipher between which way the ball is going. So the discussion is about, okay, so how are we going to score for the guy? And what positions do we want to get into that gives ourselves the best option of being in a strong position and the willingness to score? And I think that's where the let's call it the secret sauce lies. It's not necessarily about the footage, because the footage doesn't always allow for you to see the front on view, what are the fingers doing. In times past where you have these zoomed in views of where, let's say, the broadcaster had shown a skit of it, and we get to see what it looks like when a ball is turning away and when the ball is turning in. I think it was more about the options that we need to be looking at. And then we have that swing around the room in terms of, okay, so what works for you? Okay, maybe I can try that. So the next day we're in training, okay, let's try this and let's try that option. Even Varuki coming around the wicket is slightly different to what, the normal angles are. So, okay, so how do we adjust to that? We often talk about experience counts for nothing if it doesn't make you better. So we've seen improvements from game 1 to game 2 in the various phases of the game, but it still doesn't mean that we were far from good enough. And that's something that we have to really admit for ourselves. So how do we get better now in the middle phase of the game and extend it obviously to the back end? Wickets in hand is always going to be critical. Even in a chase of 310, we had a nice structure of how we want to try and find ourselves in various phases of the game. Where are we at 30 overs? What gives us the best chance at the back end? But unfortunately, you're coming up against one of the best in the world, and he was too good on the day.